All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Alastair and Dale, you guys hear me, right?
Yep.
Perfect. All right, so hello everyone, and thanks for joining Navigating Healthcare Data Quality Challenge and Actionable Discussion. My name's Jordan Levis, and I'm part of the marketing team here at IMO. Before we get started, I want to take care of a few healthcare items. So first off, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be available to you for future viewing after the presentation. Throughout the session, all attendees will be in listen-only mode, but if you have any questions, type them into the questions section on your GoToWebinar console. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A. We'll get to as many questions as we can, but if for any reason yours is not answered, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. So today we have two presenters, Alastair Allen, Chief Technology Officer at Better, and Dale Sanders, Chief Strategy Officer here at IMO. As mentioned before, if you have any questions or comments while our presenters are speaking, please type them into the questions section. And with all of this being said, I'm going to go on and pass it over to Dale.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks, Alastair. Really appreciate you taking time in a different time zone, friend, to join. I'm looking forward to this conversation today. Thanks a lot.
No problem, Dale. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me along.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so here we go, friends. There's the title. Jordan mentioned that, right? There we are. Our Alastair's much more handsome picture than mine. So the storyline today goes something like this. We've got a few poll questions to establish kind of audience demographics, who's in the audience today, some opinions and things like that. I've got a short overview of IMO. This is not about IMO today, friends, but I think at least knowing a little bit about IMO in the context of this discussion is important. Then I'll make a couple of assertions and hypotheses, and it will be interesting to hear the audience and Alastair's reaction to those during the discussion. And then we'll dive into what Better does and the company and its solution. And as I mentioned in social media posts about this webinar today, I don't have any kind of financial interest in Better. IMO has no financial interest in Better. I'm just intrigued by the company and the way that it goes about deploying its platform to bring data together and knit together an entire patient story. And I'm also sort of intrigued that it has a presence in so many countries. So, you know, it seems to me they figured something out, how to adapt to different countries and different healthcare systems. And it's also kind of interesting to me that they have no presence in the US yet. So there you have it, friends. So let's jump right into a poll question to understand our audience a bit more. And Jordan will pop this up on everybody's screen. What is your primary role in healthcare? And that'll help us tailor some of the comments and questions and things. And the results are coming in. Click, 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 click. Okay.
Give it a few more seconds, Dale, and I'll close it.
Okay.
All right. So it looks like 31% is technology and consultant, 28% is executive and administrative, 24% clinical informatics, and 17% data analyst.
Okay, well that's actually a really good sampling of backgrounds here. So I hope we'll be able to relate to that quite well with our comments today. Thanks, everyone. All right, here we go. So here's another poll question. It's a little bit leading the witness here. I suspect we know the answer to this, but how satisfied are you with the current state of clinical data interoperability and aggregated data analysis? And you could argue that those are two different things, right? Interoperability and aggregated data, but the truth is they're really kind of one and the same, right? Interoperability, we're exchanging individual patient records between healthcare systems and payers and that kind of thing. But then aggregated is just rolling up those records into a single view. So I tend to look at one as building the other. So I'd love to see everyone's, yeah, okay, no surprise there, right? Generally, we're pretty dissatisfied. Okay, and I think doesn't matter. You know, as a patient, we see it, and certainly in the data world, we see it. So That's another thing I'm sort of intrigued by better, like, wow, maybe are they doing something that we could learn from in the US? So we'll put the pressure on Alastair to teach all of us here a bit.
No pressure.
Okay. Any thoughts or reactions to that, friend? Are you surprised by those poll results?
No, I think that reflects certainly the customers that I speak with. I think it summarizes it quite well.
Does it, and do you hear the same complaints about interoperability and data standards and aggregation in the other countries that you work in?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, we've been trying, I think this idea of interoperability, we'll get into it later. I think for many years, a lot of organizations have struggled with it, moving data around in between different systems.
Yeah.
And I think that's fundamentally what we're doing that's a little bit different. So we've come out from a slightly different direction, which I'll explain later. But I think it provides a different lens and helps solve some of those problems.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. This is a worldwide problem. Okay, so here's the IMO overview slide for those of you who don't know IMO, and there's a fair amount of IMO clients who don't know they know IMO. And these terms on the left, they're not blessed by Jordan and the marketing team, but this is how I describe IMO. It's the clinical vocabulary company, and we just make clinical data better for physicians and analysts. That's essentially what we try to do. It's been around for a long time. It's in 20 plus countries, 100 different partner sites, all sorts of patents in the vocabulary space, lots of physicians using it every day, lots of hospitals, especially in the US. Amazing client retention, which I cross my fingers and hope that never changes. And over 5 million terms mapped to 38 different coding systems. It's a very robust company, and it's what I like about my personal brand being affiliated with IMO is it's an affordable product that clinicians appreciate. And so when you can combine affordability with high satisfaction, that feels really good to me and my personal values. So that's one reason I'm proud to be a part of IMO, in addition to what I think we can do to help improve clinical data quality for the betterment of interoperability and analytics and physician satisfaction. So there you go, that's us. But as I mentioned here, it's kind of interesting. McKinsey did a survey for us last year and found out that only 40% of IMO clients actually know that they're using IMO. So kind of also interesting in that study that 80% of IMO clients believe that clinical terminology is critical to their organization. So there is an appreciation for it, but there's not much recognition for IMO. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so here are a couple of my assertions here today. I'm big on assertions and hypotheses and putting a stake in the ground. And then, at this age and stage of life, I will change my opinion in a heartbeat in the face of better evidence to do that. And I have no ego tied up in wrong assertions or wrong hypotheses. And so interoperability and secondary use of aggregated patient data, I believe, suffers in large part because we're not collecting that data using standardized and clinically relevant vocabularies. I also want to emphasize that when I talk about collecting data, I'm not talking about adding more clicks to a patient's or a physician's life. Like if I could start things over, I would say we're going to give every EHR and we're going to give our national quality standards like 20 clicks. We're going to put the burden of 20 clicks on a patient, on a physician, and no more. And we have to figure out how to make those 20 clicks as valuable as possible in terms of a data collection strategy. And maybe it's more like 10 clicks, I don't know, but my whole goal in life is to relieve the data entry burden that physicians suffer from right now. So when I talk about collecting more standardized data, it doesn't mean with more clicks to a mouse. Second assertion here is the path to interoperability should not depend on deploying a single vendor solution. And so, it's kind of interesting, right? What I see a lot in the industry, and I went through this at Northwestern, we had, Cerner on the inpatient side, Epic on the outpatient side. And the interoperability between the two of those was so painful that we ended up replacing Cerner with Epic. Now, I think you could also argue that, Epic is a more user-friendly, more robust product that generally has higher satisfaction in the industry now. But that aside, converging on a single EHR to solve our interoperability problems just doesn't seem like a very good idea. Ripping, replacing an existing EHR is super costly, it's very time consuming, and it's organizationally distracting. And the incremental ROI that you get from that, nobody really can vouch for it, especially when you balance it against the cost. Now, physician satisfaction may go up, right, with the use of a consistent, more friendly EHR, and there's certainly a lot of value in that. But I just don't think as a country we should accept the fact that, collapsing onto one EHR is the answer to our interoperability problems. Okay, that's the assertions. Now, a couple of hypotheses to explore today with Alastair. First one, are open standards such as Open Air, Open EHR, and FHIR viable alternatives to interoperability and aggregated data analysis? That's going to be a fundamental part of what we explore today with Alastair. And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I have some biases, but we'll see if those biases hold up. Is there anything inherent about these open standards which solves the vocabulary problem? I really want to find out from Alastair what they're doing in their space with vocabulary standardization. And then finally, the other question to explore here is, are there any vendors who are leveraging these open standards to provide an effective, scalable, affordable offering? And that's in large part what we're exploring with Better today, okay? And maybe some of the other vendors I don't know about. All right, friend, so this is where I turn it over to you, Alastair. I will steer the slides. You tell me when to move forward. And from this point on, I think it's mostly you, friend.
Sure, yeah. Well, nice to meet everyone. Jordan introduced me, but I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Better. So I'm going to cover some of the points on the screen and hopefully have an interaction with Dale as we go along. So if you want to, I guess, flip to the first slide, Dale. So this is our mission at Better, and it's really quite simple, actually. It's how do we simplify the work of health and care teams to improve outcomes for individuals and patients. Dale talked already about the admin burden. That's a big part of what we do, how to create solutions that are really easy to use, minimizing the burden on physicians, and how do we do that in a way that's, ultimately, I think, centered around the patient and working back from what problems are we trying to solve and trying to deliver services with digital technology that address those problems. So that's our mission, and that's kind of what we align with in the products that we build.
A simple mission statement.
Yeah, and as an organization, I think we've actually been working in healthcare now for over 30 years. We're headquartered in Slovenia in Europe, with offices in the UK and Germany as well. About 150 people. And about 120 customers now across 20 markets. And I'll talk in a second about what some of those customers are and some of the problems we're helping them to solve. Across that, we manage about 22 million patient records. And we do a lot of work with partners as well. We work with technology partners to supplement and complement our platform. And we also work with partners to help us deliver solutions and solve problems for customers. So next slide, Dale.
I have a quick question for you, friend.
Yeah.
Do you do any cross-country data analysis on those 22 million patients? Are you aggregating any of that content?
We don't. So we typically don't actually own the data. So we provide the tools and the technology for customers to manage the data. So they will still be the data controllers and manage the data. So we don't actually have access to or the ability to do that sort of cross analysis.
Yeah.
But again, we'll get into it later. What we do provide is, I guess, the core structures and the ability to make sure we're storing data in really well modeled data models that allow customers to do analytics and clinical research and things like that.
Thanks.
So our presence, as you can see, is kind of largely Western Europe. The NHS is a big customer for us in the UK. A lot of activity around, Germany, France, Spain, Italy. The Nordics is a really interesting area, especially for open air or open EHR. I'll talk about that in a little minute. But they're probably one of the leading areas in terms of adoption of that as an approach, and some of the benefits that it provides. Last year, we had our first customers down under in Australia and New Zealand, and hopefully we'll see some more blue dots to the left-hand side of that screen in the coming year as well.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you don't have any presence even in Canada yet. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah. I think, as I say, we want to nail it before we scale it, as the saying goes, and identify the right partners to support us.
Yeah.
This is some of our customers. So I'm not going to go through all of these customers, but I might just pick out a couple just to give you a little sense of how we're helping solve some problems. Probably the most topical at the minute is in the top left, is One London. They just went live 2 weeks ago. Really interesting because it demonstrates a topic that I'm going to maybe talk about in the next couple of slides, a move to more regional models of care delivery. In the NHS in the UK, they've recently adopted what's called integrated care systems. The entire NHS is now organised into 42 of these integrated care systems, and each is essentially it's a partnership between health and care providers working together to help deliver better care to a population of people. London actually comprises 5 integrated care systems together with the London ambulance service, and what we've delivered for the initial go live is a pathway for anyone on an urgent care plan or an end of life care plan that sits across the entire region of 10.5 million people, provides access to all the patients, their family, any informal carers. But we're also integrating that into every EHR across London. So from a direct care perspective, if any patient presents in any care setting, you've got real-time immediate access to their care plan. And all of that data is held in this open air format, which can be used for secondary use and other purposes as well. And London's ambition then is to continue to add more pathways, and I'll show you some examples of that later in terms of how they achieve or hope to achieve that and what the solution looks like. So that's a really exciting project for us in London. We also work with a lot of hospitals and providers. The Christie is the largest cancer network in Europe. They've re-architected their whole approach from a sort of EHR application centered approach to a data centered approach built on open EHR, and they're currently going through a process of transformation, which is really exciting as well. All the way through finally to some national customers. So NHS Wales is a good example, who are starting to take a data centered approach to transformation from a national perspective and building national services around that that support their population. So it's quite it's a diverse group of patients, or not patients, a diverse group of customers. So it makes it really interesting and exciting to be part of that and helping to support those customers on their journey.
In these deployments, in these integrated health networks, like One London and the NHS trusts and things, Ren, are you? Well, let me back up. So they're basically start to finish healthcare, I would imagine. So primary care, specialty care, inpatient, long-term care, kind of all rolled into a sort of a community health network. Is that how to describe it?
Absolutely. It's a partnership between all of the healthcare, social care as well together, and increasingly that's where strategic initiatives and governance and commissioning decisions are made in order to, rather than adopting a sort of a localized fragmented approach, it's trying to coordinate best practice across that population in order to achieve better outcomes.
That's awesome. So what are you doing to knit all of those healthcare services together with your platform?
Yeah, well, I can show you the detail in a couple of slides, but ultimately what we're trying to do is, if you think about, I've got an example in a bit of a patient who is maybe seen by our GP. You've maybe had a fall and you go to A&E. You know, there's maybe an end of life pathway. You're seeing a palliative care nurse. Lots of different interactions across lots of different care settings, and the thing that we don't have before is a joined up service to manage that person's care plan and coordinate the activity around that person between all the different settings. So we've created basically a service really that sits across all of the different EHRs, and then I'll show you how we've done it in a few slides, but we've integrated that into the existing EHR. So if I'm a physician and I'm using Cerner or Epic, I don't have to go into another system. I access this solution natively within that solution as well.
Wow, very interesting. Almost like a care management platform on top of disparate EHRs. Is that a safe statement?
Absolutely. And then incrementally getting control of your data. So you're not only coordinating care, but you're actually providing a real-time read-write capability. The data is being structured in this open vendor neutral format called open air. And as you start to layer on different pathways for different conditions, diabetes, mental health, COPD, you're incrementally getting in control of your data and building up a repository that facilitates sharing and data use and reuse across that region.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
This slide, I think this summarizes, we've kind of touched on some of this, but these are some of the themes that we see, and obviously healthcare is a broad spectrum, and we try to focus on certain problems. Increasingly, as we've all witnessed, care is shifting from hospitals into communities closer to patients' homes. We've seen citizens want increasingly to be more engaged in managing their health and increasingly more engaged in actually staying well and wellness services. And they want access to their health record. They want to be able to contribute to it. In many cases, they want friends or carers to also be able to do that on their behalf. And finally, I think we've probably all witnessed what happened with COVID, but from my perspective and the customers we've worked with, it just completely changed the dynamic in terms of expectation around the speed of delivery and being able to work and support new models of care. And we've really taken that on board and really trying to understand how can we provide more flexibility for customers to essentially innovate more quickly and maintain that kind of precedent that COVID set. So these are some of the things that we think about a lot whenever we're designing our products.
Mm-hmm. Similar themes across the world in healthcare, right? It's pretty interesting.
Absolutely. I think the problems are the same. I think, you know, every country is maybe there's a different way to pay for health or commission, but the underlying problems I think are very familiar.
Yeah, it's one of the problems I've always had with the U.S. healthcare system is that we can be a little bit arrogant, believing that we're a little different, and you know we don't want to borrow or learn lessons from any other countries. But the truth is, we're all trying to pursue the same goals, and borrowing ideas that work in other countries is, you know, perfectly acceptable in my mind. Hence why we're talking today.
Yeah, absolutely. And this slide then I think just goes a little bit further, and you know, really I think for us, I think we're in the middle of a generational shift of how we actually organize and deliver care. At the left side of the screen, I think is called here Generation 1, very much a tactical environment, lots of siloed systems, lots of paper actually as well, not an awful lot of sharing. I think probably in the States, a lot of organizations and providers might see Generation 2 here as being familiar. It's very much an EHR centered landscape, starting to share information through APIs and using FHIR for that, but it's still very much orientated around the provider or the organization or the EHR. what we're seeing, and very much in the UK with stories like London, but even more widely, is an emergence of this regional model of care, national models of care that are no longer orientated around an individual organization or provider or EHR, but are actually centered around the patient, with the data held in an open, unified format, and the supporting tools that allow care or innovation and services to be built more quickly, but still maintaining that governance. And I think examples like London demonstrate this shift is now starting to take place. And again, this is something that we think about a lot in terms of how can we provide the technology and the digital services to support organizations as they start to try and deliver services that are joined up, no matter where the patient might be at any time. So this is just a view of our perspective.
You've got low-code development functions. You're going to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I'll introduce it now. I think maybe it comes up on the next slide. I think for anyone not familiar with this terminology, I sometimes use the analogy of Lego building blocks. It's really how can we start to assemble applications using pre-built components in a way that doesn't require a team of software engineers. Typically, if you look at trying to solve a new problem comes along, you either historically go and buy a product, or you buy a team of software engineers to build it for you, or if you've already got a product, you go to the vendor and you ask them to make a change. What we're trying to do with the low code approach is try and bridge that gap in the middle, where we're able to bring that flexibility actually back into the customer, so the change can actually happen at a customer level, and it doesn't need to be IT led. Because it doesn't need developers, you can almost bring change out of the IT department into the clinicians and the whole health care community, and try and, with the right guardrails in place around safety and governance, allow services to be built and prototyped and get them into production much more quickly. And that is actually, again, to use the same example we've been chatting about with London, we've actually created the entire set of urgent care planning forms with the low code development capability, and again, all hinged on making sure the data is actually then held in an open vendor neutral format and not stored in another silo. That's really important as well.
So you've got the open air core, which is that's your core part of the platform, right? And then has better wrapped that with this low code configurable code. Yeah. Okay.
Might even be on the next slide. Go to the next slide. Just I can't remember the order.
Oh, we got a poll
question. Got a poll question.
Yeah.
We'll maybe come back to the poll question. Flip forward 2 slides and I'll just answer that question. It's
okay.
Not, yeah. Here we go. This is it. So this is maybe this will help provide some context for the poll question as well. This is a sort of really high level logical view of the platform that we're working on. The bottom layer is really important. So this is we have a saying, data is for life, and in one of your hypotheses earlier, you were on surgeons talking about convergence and the impact of that. I completely agree with that, but ultimately I think data is going to outlive any application. Applications come and go and change all the time. You mentioned with Epic and somewhere else that what we need to make sure is that we're storing data in a vendor neutral format independently to the applications. The analogy sometimes I use, it's similar to DICOM and PACS images, albeit there's some variations there, but that a standard for DICOM has been established and adopted really well for many years, and it's trying to take that idea and translate it to this structured clinical data as well, and that's where OpenAIR comes in. OpenAIR is a specification and a set of data models that the community have created around modeling and managing healthcare information in a format that isn't tied to any vendor, betters, or anyone else's. And it puts then the healthcare organization in control of the data and gives that long-term vendor neutral approach to work up from. So that
well, and you're not paying licensing fees, right? Or minimal licensing fees for that.
Well,
right?
there's different, like any kind of specification. There's open source implementations. There's commercial implementations. The data models are all open source, all free, all in the community. There's about 1,000. I can't remember the exact number. Really rich library of proven data models that have been used for many years. And typically, I think on many of the projects we work on, 70–80% of the models that already exist are reused on new projects. That's all open source. That's all available. The better platform, there's a license to execute that, but equally, there's open source alternatives in other ways. The key being that the data is held in a format. You could move that to any, and actually EY did a great paper recently to prove this point of storing data in the open air format and actually being able to run it and move it between different implementations of an open air server. And it all runs across any vendor as long as they conform to the specification. So it gives you that kind of vendor neutral capability that is long term for the organization. So that's the core of what we've built the platform on. But one thing is getting your data well modeled and getting that in place. The next thing is, okay, how can I get value from that data? How do I solve problems? And this is where the next level up is this low code capability that we've talked about. There's a lot of low code tools on the market. I think typically a lot of them focus on the UI element or the process element and dragging and dropping components onto the form, and then at the end trying to map the data somewhere, or maybe putting the data into another data store. What we've actually done differently is flip this upside down and said, start with your data models, get those in place. Your terminology then is embedded as part of that, so you're capturing as well this structured coded data. And then whenever you're operating in the low code environment, it's automatically bound to the data models. So you don't have to have another process to say, well, this field, let's map it to this data. It's within the studio tools. You're able to actually see natively the data models that you've built and you've got available, and that's what you use to build the forms and collect the data. So by putting that in place, you're able to very quickly then create these applications on these proven data models and prototype that and work with health and care teams to validate that. So that's that low code layer. That's, as I say, what we use with all of our projects now to deliver solutions that we've talked about. And then finally at the top, it's how do we make this available to health and care teams in a simple, easy to use format. We've done a few things here as well. We've created a design system, which is really how do we make sure that there's a uniform look and feel and set of behavioral aspects, so there's consistency across all the applications. We don't want low code tools creating lots of different disjointed experiences for clinicians. So we've created a design system that makes that really easy. We've got some standalone applications like medication administration, for example, but equally the low code applications, we quite often embed those into local EHRs, and we'll see that on the next slide. But we spend a lot of time trying to make that a seamless process as well, so that we can surface these applications within existing systems.
Interesting.
As opposed to trying to, what we don't want is new applications that clinicians have to go to another URL in their web browser to learn something new again. It's that idea of complementing existing investments, working alongside the EHRs that are there.
Interesting. I think I missed that in our early conversation. So you surface some of these apps within the UI experience of Epic or Cerner or Allscripts or Meditech or whatever. Huh.
Exactly. Yeah. And then what you're able to do then is, once you establish those links with the application, you're able to manage the change centrally. And if you think then about if we are shifting to a regional model and we're delivering services to hundreds of healthcare providers, we can actually manage that change centrally and push it out
Right.
from one place, as opposed to having to make changes in every single system that's deployed across an environment. So, you know, a lot of benefits in terms of the ongoing operational aspects of the solution as well.
One last question here, friend, and then I'll suppose we probably ought to move along. This is fascinating. So what's the technology you use in that application layer?
So the application layer, it's all from a technology perspective. It's a JavaScript framework for the front end components. We work alongside then we have to build direct relationships with the EHRs. We leverage open standards like OAuth and OpenID Connect, Smart on Fire to achieve that context launch. Single sign-on is a big part of what we do as well. And then obviously cloud-based services to host the back end to make that really secure and resilient as well.
Fascinating. Okay, should we go back to the poll questions really quick?
Oh yeah, back to the poll.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Jordan, here you go, friend. How important is it for your organization to have clinical data that is stored in an open vendor neutral format? This is kind of interesting, right? Because the EHR vendors all have their sort of proprietary data store. And then you have companies like the company I was previously affiliated with, Health Catalyst, which pulls data from multiple EHRs into a common repository. But that's also not vendor neutral. So yeah, very interesting. Neutral. So 2/3 believe it's very important, but yet there really isn't a solution for that in the US yet, I would argue. But we'll touch base in the Q&A maybe with that. Okay. Well, it sort of validates one of your values of better, right? So this is a good question, right? How familiar is the audience with the open air standard? I was more familiar prior to us meeting. I was more familiar with Open MRS than I was Open Air, but I'm vaguely familiar with it. But so the poll questions are coming in here. Looks like we've stabilized, and
I think that's a fair reflection. It's good to see so many people sort of familiar, which is
that's a higher number than I expected. Actually, that would have been my camp too. Then we have a smattering of people that are very familiar. That's interesting. Okay. All right, here we go. Back to the slides. Let me get your animation going here, friend.
Yeah, you can run those all in. This is really just we sort of talked about it at the start, so I'll not try to labor the point, but we're big proponents of what problem are we trying to solve and making sure we work back from the problem as opposed to just building technology. And I think this is a scenario that we sometimes talk about to illustrate, and that this is, a sort of example taken from London. We've got Mary here, 86, on an end of life care plan. Mary is supported by Mark, who's an informal carer, but Mary interacts with large parts of the healthcare system, obviously her GP, her community nurse, but she's had a couple of falls as well. So, she's in and out of NE, interacts with first responders, and then obviously working with the palliative care nurse in terms of quality of life. And typically what we find, and again, where you're looking at lots of different care settings across maybe large geographies, lots of different applications, and each application managing the data in their own environment and transferring subsets of that information maybe to another setting. Quite often the data is maybe poorly coded, not coded at all, and you're originating poor data which is then shared. This makes it really hard to, number one, for Mary to actually get a joined up view of what her in this case, what our care plan is across the entire estate. You can't get access to that. But equally, if Mary arrives in NE, it makes it more difficult for that NE nurse to see what information has been held in all our systems. And typically, to provide a really simple joined up service, you've got some options. You may choose to make some localized changes within the local EHR to support that particular need. There may equally be back-end changes to support that integration and that interoperability. But all of this change, it brings with it change management. The organizations need to manage this change, and you start to look at that. How do we do this at scale across an area the size of London? That's lots of change management that needs to be managed. Equally, a lot of vendors within that maybe need to make changes, the EHR vendors or other specialty systems. And really then, even if you were to make all of these changes, then the person still, at the end of the day, is finding it quite fragmented in terms of being able to provide a joined up experience.
Yeah.
So that's the problem that one of the problems that we're seeing, especially around this idea of care coordination with a lot of customers. And if you flip to the next slide, I can show you a visual on our sort of approach to addressing that. So we've really taken a platform approach, as I've talked about, with this idea of persistent data that's separated from the applications. And we've combined this with the low-code tools to try and enable a faster pace of change, but also given the local flexibility to the customer. So they're able to configure the solution to their local needs, and also trying to reduce the dependencies on all the application vendors. Again, when you're trying to do this at scale, that run into large numbers. So the key things we talked about, the monitor on the left, that represents the EHR or the system that a health or care team will use today. So they'll continue to go in to their Cerner or their Epic or whatever. Mary may actually have access to patient applications or personal health records. We want Mary to continue to go into the same application with single sign-on. The last thing we want is another set of usernames and passwords. Secondly, if there's a care plan available for Mary, all of the health and care team should be able to see that natively within their EHR. And when they select that option, they should be able to launch in context. We've talked about some standards like Smart on Fire and other approaches to facilitate that. But that then brings up, really on the right-hand side is what we've called this sort of canvas idea. In London, they've deployed an urgent care pathway. But ultimately then, it's how do you start to layer on additional care pathways? And a patient can be on one or many care pathways, as we know. But these can then be managed on using this uncreated, using the low-code tools, and it allows us to expand really quickly with minimal dependency. As soon as we have that kind of single sign-on and launch context, we're able to support new services and innovation independently and centrally. And all of the data then, if you flip to the next transition, all of that data is being held in a vendor-neutral format that will run on any open air-based server. And that over time really starts to organize your data, make sure it's captured and coded. And of course, some of that data needs to go back into the EHR, and we facilitate that with data exchange where necessary as well. And really, at the end, if you look at a target state, you've got coexistence between the existing set of EHRs that are there. You've got coexistence of all the different health and care teams in different care settings, but cross-cutting services that support the patient and data that's really semantically harmonized and normalized, that the customer can see, understand, use, and also reuse as well. So that's how we go about some of these problems, and that is exactly what we've deployed with London.
I might mention to the audience, if you have questions, you can start entering those questions. And yeah, so John Lee asked, your friend John Lee, very accomplished US CMIO, asks, is the content discrete and actionable, or is it largely view-only content?
No, it's actionable. Absolutely. So the last thing we want to do is just, I think we're not a portal. I think that adds value, and portal, not to discredit portal, great, you know, but ultimately what we want is to be able to coordinate care, perform actions, capture information, make sure across all the different care settings, and it needs to be interactive. It's very much not read only.
Mm-hmm. How are you harmonizing vocabulary across these EHRs, Ren? Like, right, that's one of the fundamental problems. How do you harmonize the language, and I mean down to the data level, right? The format and the data types and
so it's embedded in the model. So the terminology is referenced directly in the archetypes. So the archetype is the open air model, and as part of the clinicians, all the models are designed by clinical informaticians, and the terminology and the coding is defined within the model, and you can configure that inside the model. And whenever I capture data, in this example, in my urgent care plan, if I'm capturing a diagnosis, it'll be coded according to the value set that's defined within the open air data model.
Huh. Interesting. Okay, Rick Moore, another good friend here in the audience. Given what you know about U.S. healthcare, do you see a pathway for a national architecture? It seems the success you are having with open air model is premised on this national architecture.
So I don't think there would ever be a single, I guess it depends what we mean by national architecture. I think ultimately it would be a target state would be where we've got a common set of data models that are used consistently, and that can be deployed locally within providers, regionally or nationally. I think ultimately when we talk about interoperability, the key thing that we're trying to do with open air is, rather than moving data around between applications and transforming it, if we're able to actually design the systems in this way and capture data according to the common set of models, kind of get interoperability as a side effect of that, because everybody's talking the same language. It doesn't mean that there needs to be one kind of server or one implementation. It's the adoption of the models that are important. And I guess the challenge there is how could we achieve that in that environment? You know, that's what we're working towards. That's what we've been working towards in Europe. I think Catalonia, for anybody who isn't familiar, is a really good example. So the Catalonian Health Service last year came out and said, we can't do this anymore. The current approach to interoperability is not working for us. They are certainly currently going through a procurement process, and they're going to re-architect for the entire region of Catalonia an architecture based around open air and the idea of adopting this common set of data models. And they've really just turned on its head their interpretation of what they mean by interoperability. So yeah, I think it's one of the questions we get is how do we get there? It's a big jump to go from where we are to that target state, and of course there's various strategies for that.
Well, starting regionally would be good, right? Even if, you know, and this is the challenge that the U.S. healthcare model has, is that the incentives to collaborate in a community, if physicians or care providers are not affiliated with the core healthcare system, for example, Intermountain Healthcare here in Salt Lake City, you know, there aren't a whole lot of economic incentives for Intermountain Healthcare to interact with non-Intermountain Healthcare care providers. And so therefore, who's going to fund a model like this, right? But, you know, anyway, we could talk a lot about that, but there's some interesting things going on at ONC and CMS to encourage interoperability across those care teams and care organizations, yeah. Okay, we got some more questions here, Bryn. Before I go further with the audience questions, is there another slide that you want to bring up that we should talk about?
I think the only other slide, I'm happy to, if we've run out of time, you want to take a few questions, is how do we get there? But we don't need to go through that if you'd prefer to. I think there was a couple of slides on that.
I could stay over to ask or answer questions. I don't know if you can or not.
No, I'll just quickly run through what this is, and then we'll go to the questions. I think this is just the evolution of EHRs, and even, you know, when people talk about how do we get to more of a platform approach, everybody wants to get there, but it's where do you start? And quite often, you know, even though you have an EHR in place, there'll be lots of problems that maybe doesn't solve or needs to support. And also one of the really interesting things that in Europe we have this thing called GDPR, which is like data protection, and it forced everybody to actually audit what information has been stored and where, and the results were, you know, actually hundreds and in some cases thousands of other applications that have grown around the EHR as well, sort of represented here in the top right or top left. So, you know, what our approach is incremental, basically. So we say the next time one of those problems comes along, and if it's not well fitted to the EHR, don't create another silo. Move to a platform approach, build an application, start to get your data in order, and then over time you create this ecosystem of applications that are managing data in this open format, and still continues to work alongside your EHR and can coexist. But it's that incremental, agile journey of, you know, being able to deliver benefit early that we promote in terms of how to get there.
Very interesting, Brent. Here's another question from Zhao Almeida. I don't know Zhao. We all agree health data standards are key to interop. How would we compare the data models in OpenAir with Odyssey and OMOP? Yeah, I've been wondering that too, Zhao. That's in the back of my mind. How does OpenAir compare to Odyssey and OMOP? Can you speak to that?
So I think the target audience, if you like, for something like OMOP is more secondary use and research, and it's optimized for that kind of an environment. There are lots of community initiatives underway to convert FHIR to OMOP and OpenAir to OMOP. So I think that they exist as complementary things, but more so, I think OMOP sitting in the sort of research and analytics model space, as opposed to the kind of the primary direct care model that we've talked about.
That's how I would characterize it too. There is this interesting convergence, isn't there? But
well, there's a convergence. I think there's a convergence with, I think, and then it gets into, sometimes I get the question about, you know, well, if we've got FHIR, why do we need OpenAir?
Right.
Kind of got concentric Venn diagrams. There is overlap between a lot of these things, but it's trying to understand, you know, you need a collection of standards to actually solve a range of problems. You know, and we use FHIR a lot in the platform, certainly at an API level, and providing APIs into the OpenAir data. FHIR works really well, but for the long-term storage of information, we think OpenAir is the right approach, and then things like OMOP for other use cases as well. So it's very much a coexistence.
Yeah. Okay, Dennis Giokas, another good friend. These questions are like a high school reunion. It's good to hear from everybody. Dennis and I collaborated a lot in the Canadian healthcare space a few years ago. He asks, in Europe, OpenAir is or was a standard under ISO and CEN. And as I recall, trade agreements required adherence. I didn't know that. We don't have that as a driver in North America, US and Canada. What is the incentive for vendor uptake in North America? Well, competition probably, right? And sort of, I think all of us have, I'll take a shot at answering that. I think all of us have to start expressing our dissatisfaction with money, right? And, you know, I wish, you know, I don't wish any bad things on Cerner, and as a veteran, what's going on with the Cerner deployment in VA and DoD is pretty troubling. But that kind of money, we could have held aside some to incentivize these kind of changes to EHRs and interoperability. So I feel very badly for Cerner, actually, and I, as a veteran, I want it to be successful, but I wish that we would start voting with our dissatisfaction with interoperability and expense for these EHRs with our dollars and our procurement. But I think as long as we keep buying the products that don't support this kind of approach, I think then it's unlikely to change. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Alastair?
Well, I think a lot of the change that we've seen is driven by the customer. I think the question was around the vendor. I think from a vendor perspective, it comes back, I think, to our mission statement right at the start that I talked about. How do we provide, the technology to deliver better patient outcomes? And I think we need to do something about the data. And I think this approach is doing something about the data. I think I mentioned Catalonia. If we keep just trying to move information around and fudge it between different places, we're continuing to move the problem around. I think this is a paradigm shift in terms of how we approach that. And I think, what we've seen in the Nordics, I mentioned as well, the leading EHR vendors have all adopted OpenAir across Sweden, Norway, Denmark.
Really?
Yeah, and they're doing that on a common set of data models, and then information is able to be shared across all of the different care settings across those countries. This is, and the vendors are doing that to work back and hopefully deliver better patient outcomes. And I think that's the incentive for me for the vendors. I think, of course, it's a paradigm shift, but I think that doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do.
Right. One thing that I've observed in my 40 years as a tech professional across multiple industries is eventually the dominant vendors in those industries, if they don't re-engineer themselves and their technology, they become outdated, right? I mean, there's a reason we don't build software in COBOL and Fortran anymore, right? At some point, and I use Microsoft as like one of the greatest examples of a company that completely turned around its tech stack, right? But you have to have the wherewithal to say, look, our infrastructure that we've used so far to get us to this point is no longer modern, scalable, and valuable to our clients. And so I hope, that some of the dominant vendors in the EHR market today are plotting, version 2 or 3 of their products. We'll see.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, and yeah, we're getting some interesting thoughts and compliments back, Alastair. So good on you for that, friend. John Lee asked another question here that I think I've been wondering about it as well. And he asks, if a patient needs a chest x-ray, how does that become actionable in various instances of various EHRs? More broadly, I'm curious about how you handle orders and results in the platform.
Yeah, that is a harder problem. You've got different, different EHRs there. The coding could be all different, and how do you handle that? I think it's probably one of those ones we haven't addressed that problem yet in London. I think I probably don't have an example to tell you how we've solved it. I think that doesn't mean we can't do it, but yeah, that's probably on the trickier side of the scale that we would need to work through.
Well, the dominant EHR vendors in the market are still trying to figure that out themselves, right? In the FHIR standard, haven't quite figured it out. And yeah, the orders and results are pretty critical to this being friendly to clinicians and reliable for patients, right?
But we like a challenge, Dale. So
yeah, I have faith that you'll figure it out too, friend. I totally do. You have the right concepts. You have the right approach to this. Okay, well, that was the last slide. And we are on time. And our questions have kind of stopped coming in. So we're probably at a time now where we can say thank you and goodbye.
All right, awesome. Thank you both for that awesome discussion. So we're going to go ahead and close out for today. We hope you found this information in the webinar useful. A recording and everything will be sent later this week. Thanks so much for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks everyone. Appreciate it. Alastair, thank you so much, man. This is super interesting.
Thanks, Dale. That was great fun. Good to chat as always.
Yeah, great to chat with you. Okay, bye everybody.